Before that time.
It's the physics behind, for example,
another
reactions,
question.
reaction to the actual change in mass.
Under the ultimate question about
During
the
father's course of 7 years, the book was put together.
Welcome to the Scholar's Chair. Tonight, a discussion on a book written by philosopher John Rawls in 1971 called The Theory of Justice. This book revitalized the social contract tradition, using it to articulate and defend a detailed vision of egalitarian liberalism. The theory of justice sets out and defends the principles of justice as fairness. Rawls takes a basic structure of society as his subject matter and utilitarianism as his principal opponent. Today, as we struggle to understand the principles of justice, I've invited to guide us through this important book of philosophy by John Rawls, Professor Emeritus Joe Oppenheimer. His educational background is a degree from Cornell University, followed by a master's degree in economics from the University of Michigan. He received a PhD in 1971 from Princeton University. He taught in the Government and Politics Department at the University of Maryland in 1976. Tonight, John Rawls' famous book, The Theory of Justice, right here in the Scholar's Chair.
Let the conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is truth?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholar's Chair every Monday night. And here is your host, Professor Oppenheimer. Welcome to the Scholar's Chair.
Thank you.
I'm glad you could make it with us. Can you give us a kind of a working overview of Rawls' role for justice? And perhaps in doing so, perhaps you can kind of explain to us what is the theory of justice?
Sure. I think John Rawls developed a theory of justice at a time when nobody was talking about that. People were talking about that what you wanted to do was make as many people as well off as possible, maximize the welfare of the society. And that was seen as sort of an objective of society. And Rawls said, wait a minute. There must be something more fundamental, and came through with this notion of justice. And he argued for it on the basis of a rather complex theory. Yeah. And the theory had just a few simple elements. First of all, he had a conjecture that we might want to call a moral conjecture or a normative conjecture, that that justice is tied to fairness. And actually there's a subtitle to this book, which is a theory of justice, justice as fairness. And so his argument was, in a fair society, there would be justice. With fair institutions, people would be justly handled and treated. And he saw that as the fundamental, if you want, skeleton of any social body. And then that was sort of his moral or position, right? And it was quite different than people had thought of before. There was not a theory of justice as fairness before this. And he then developed a notion as to how politically that was a conceivable outcome. And he's very deeply entrenched in what we might want to call the American tradition, where our political story comes from a constitutional convention. Of course, in our constitutional convention, people knew their interests. The biggest property class was slavery.
Yes, yes.
Right? And so
Males, whites, and
right. Well, there wasn't even the females weren't even
right.
invited
Yes.
to discuss what was going on. But one of the major issues was how do we protect our property, and in this case, how do we protect slavery from being ended? Rawls saw by the middle of the 20th century, look, that was the big problem. People in that constitutional convention came in with all their interests known. He said, what if nobody would know their interests? You would still want this original convention. He called that the original position.
I see.
But he said, you wouldn't want it in a manner where everybody knew what they would want for themselves.
Okay.
But rather they would have to say, I don't know whether I would end up being a slave or not. So maybe we shouldn't have slavery. I don't know whether I will be poor or rich. Maybe we ought to be very much concerned about how much support there is for the poor.
This is the idea of the veil of ignorance.
That's right. That's the veil of ignorance. That's the second big element he puts in place. So he has an original position. He has this. He's trying to gain fairness, right? And he has this original position, very American. That we're going to have a constitutional convention.
We're all born
but
equal,
everybody's
right?
But everybody's going to start out without knowing who they are.
I see.
And in there, we will then see what happens. And that's what the theory is about. He has a theory as to what would happen in this original position. And his argument is what comes out of that original position will be acceptable afterwards. It will be acceptable, at least in the main. Every once in a while, people might say, we need another convention. We need to go back and rethink some details. But the basic justice substance, he argues, will hold.
You have just opened up the entire book for me. Thank you. Because I was wondering about the idea of the original position. So thank you so much. Equality. Now, Rawls writes, justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is a system to thought. Do you agree with this idea? Is he consistent with the rest of the idea of the theory of justice?
So this is again a pretty so Rawls. We have to understand Rawls is really sort of a pioneer. One of the pioneer kind of openings he makes is an opening like that truth is, an essential element in the judgment of theory, and then he's putting forward not a theory in physics where you and I could say, gee, let's check the truth, let's do some, but a theory in something moral and about justice, and comes up with this argument that we have to consider truth. And big question then is, really, how are you going to do that? We can agree that all theory, we might agree, all theory that has to do with reality, where you're making claims about reality, we want to say, okay, does it fit? Does it conform with what we see?
With your experience?
Can we test it? Rawls developed two notions of testing in his theory. One was for the individuals. He called this reflective equilibrium. He comes back and talks about this 100 times in the book. One of the problems of the book is it's incredibly repetitious. He develops a simple sort of sketch, and then he fleshes it out a little bit more, and then he fleshes it out more and more. So by the time you're done, you've gone through the basic argument 100 times, but each time with a new layer, and you think to yourself, wait a minute, I'm not sure that it's right. But his argument is each individual has to reflect on this notion of fairness. Is this something you would accept as the basis for justice? And this is one could argue about that. One could say, is that really what people accept as justice or not? And hypothetically, you could go around and do a survey. You could say, look, what do you think justice is? Do you think it's fairness, or do you think it's following, some other law-like procedures, or what do you think is justice? So he sets it up so that it could be, at some level, discussed and tested, and people have done that.
How do you come with the position of the utilitarian perspective and Rawls' counter to it?
Okay, so you're right. That was the big foil that he set up, and it was because, in fact, political philosophy had been pretty much seriously damaged during World War II. You had all these continental philosophers like Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche and so on. And by the end of World War II and the rise of Stalinism and so on, you really had a decay of the foundations there. And what was surviving was the 19th century idea of utilitarianism.
I got you.
And that was this notion that what we're trying to do is maximize the welfare of the society. And Rawls had lots of objections to that, and so did a lot of people. One of the big objections was, how in the world can you talk about maximizing the welfare of society when we can't tell whether my pain, let's say my pain is going to be compensated for by your pleasure, right? Or vice versa. We have to compare apples and oranges to be able to talk about how many fruit we have. And that was impossible between people's welfare, he said. Many people argued. And then there was also the argument that even if you could do that, would you want to say, let's say if we could get 1 million people over here from the brink of starvation to a decent way of life, by taking this billionaire over here and reducing his income to the same level as those other people, would you want to say that we can sacrifice that person for this?
Yes.
What basis would we have to say that? And that became another problem for utilitarians. And Rawls argued these problems were not overcomable, in that you really had to start from a different position.
What do you think about the advantage of an individual established by merit, and that it would be just for him to be satisfied with that, at the same time allowing the poor to reap the benefit of what they have earned? Rawls didn't seem to be very satisfied with that. So.
No, he certainly didn't. There are all sorts of reasons he felt that way. So, for example, one of the reasons is he said, look, it's not a person's fault where they're born. You could be born in Liberia. I could have been born in, Guinea. And look at the situation we would have been in today at no fault of our own, right? We would have just been there by some accident of birth rather than any consideration of our merit.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So we could have been born poor, we could have been born rich, we could have been born slaves, we could have been born handicapped, etc., having nothing to do with our own merits. Now, he therefore argues that we really have to consider that those merit arguments are really meretricious. They really don't work. You can't really argue that a person has made it on merit. They have made it in part because of the fortune of their situation.
Yes. So it's a limited argument that he's making. I think that he's really trying to build a scaffold of the theory of justice. And I want to ask you whether he actually is able to dismantle this notion of utilitarianism as a philosophy? And does he give us an alternative view that is successful and that can be used in modern time? Does he really accomplish his aim?
Well, I think
Because I know you had disagreements with him.
Yes,
right?
I do.
Yes.
But I think my disagreements don't come from that. I think he actually did turn around the perspective of not only philosophy, but so, for example, today, Amartya Sen, an Indian philosopher, economist. Actually, he's more of an economist than he is a philosopher, and somewhat of a friend of mine. He today got a big award from Obama, an award I forget what it's called, American Arts and Humanities.
That's right.
And he's very much in the tradition of Rawls. Now he would argue he has left the Rawlsian track and started a new one, and I would agree that he has to some extent, but he certainly is not a utilitarian.
Gotcha.
He has certainly accepted Rawls's start and moved down that road a long way and then broken off.
Yeah.
And I would say that's true for a lot of people. I don't see a lot of people going back to pre-Rawlsian arguments anymore about what justice is and what we ought to think about for society.
Interesting. The object of justice, or the subject of justice, Rawls writes, the primary subject of justice is the basic structure of society, or more exactly, the way in which the major social institutions distribute fundamental rights and duties and determine the division of advantages from a social corporation. Now, is this idea, again, consistent with his overall theory? It would be. And do you agree?
Well, let me try and parse that a bit.
Sure. The object of justice, right?
So he definitely is saying that the distribution of what we might want to call the riches of society, strictly on the basis of what you earn and can earn in a market economy,
right,
would be terribly unjust under most conditions. We can, I'll just give you an example that comes from Sen, since he won this big prize today, also a Nobel Prize winner.
Yes.
He showed that in areas where you have famines, not just one area, in all areas historically, where there ever was a famine in which there was any record kept that could be analyzed, it was always the case that there was food there to feed the people. And the problem was not that there was no food, but that the people couldn't buy it. They didn't have the means to buy it. Now, often when you talk about privatizing things, you create the possibility, for example, privatizing water rights. Imagine that we have a bunch of herders in this Sudan,
right,
and they're herding goats, and they have all the right to use a stream for water for their animals.
Yeah.
If we privatize the rights so that there's a market in them, they may very well sell their rights at a time when water is quite plentiful and they can use the money for other things. And then when water becomes scarce because of a drought, they'll find that they can't support themselves because the animals will die. And they won't have money, and they won't be able to buy the water for their animals. Whereas it could have been that they could have developed some kind of sharing mechanism.
Yes.
Privatizing allows for a different distribution. I'm not saying it doesn't do some good things also, but the market leads to problems like this, and famines and so on.
Right.
And leads to unfairness. And so what Rawls is advocating is that we think about all those kind of things ahead of time from a fairness point of view. And he develops actually some very, very big conjectures about this. He says, if people are in this original position and they really don't know their interests, they will agree on 5 things. They will agree they want a contract. They will not say, oh, I don't need a contract, let's just go and live our lives and find out what in the world's going to go on and who's going to come out on top. They're going to say, no, let's first have a contract.
Yes.
And then he says they will be able to reach that contract unanimously. And it will always be the same contract. And it will be a contract in which people will say you must have basic liberties and you must maximize the welfare of the worst off.
Right.
And then last, he says, after they leave this original position and they go into their society, that contract will be stable. People will respect it and say, that's what we want to live by.
Like freedom of religion, like freedom of conscience, and
Right.
the ability to acquire property.
That's right.
Which is our fundamental principles of our Constitution. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about housing into a contract, the fundamentals of the principles
That's
of
right,
justice.
of liberty.
I see.
And then the issues of distribution, so that nobody's going to end up being worse off than they could possibly be.
Gotcha.
So he's trying to maximize the welfare of the worst off. Nobody can make so much money that somebody on the bottom is made worse off.
Or can't survive.
No, he would say, or made worse off. He would be much more egalitarian. That's why I agree with you when you said it's a radical egalitarian liberalism. Now, these are testable conjectures. Each one of those is testable. They're hard to test, but they're testable. You could say people won't know really who they are if they don't have any interests. If you could imagine yourself, or I could imagine myself, and not knowing my race, my religion, my education, my skills, what kind of society I was going to live in, I wouldn't be a person, right? I must know some things about myself. I must know that, oh yeah, I have 2 functioning hands, and so on. Those are things babies learn, right? But without that sort of veil of ignorance, people will very much say, I know what my interests are. So there has to be some kind of continuum, and you're trying to find out, just like when you test, like, how does a body behave in a vacuum? You don't really develop a complete vacuum, but you get close to it.
Right.
So here too, if you get close to a veil of ignorance, is it the case that people behave the way Rawls says? And the answer there is almost. But not quite.
Right.
And there's one
It's
thing
not
that
perfect justice, what you're saying?
well, is one thing he really was wrong on, and everything else he was really right on. First of all, we did hundreds of experiments, and then other people didn't believe us, and they were done really pretty much all over the world.
And when you say we, who
a very good friend of mine who died last year, Norm Frolick.
Right.
And I ran these experiments in the United States, Canada, communist Poland. I'm leaving out some places. Can't believe that, but okay.
So what is the control question that allows you to
So
do the test?
what we do is we brought people into a lab, but then people did many experiments all over the world, somewhat at variance with what we did too, and to test whether it was viable. But I'll tell you what we did was we bring in a group of 5 people, and we would tell them they had no idea as to whether they were going to be rich or poor or what the task was going to be, but they were going to earn some money. And they had to decide whether or not they wanted to have a contract first. And if they wanted a contract, they had to work it out. And then there were some lessons they had to learn a little bit about what it meant, it meant to have but then the agreement was that if it took too long to have a contract, any one person could say, okay, look, I've had enough, no contract, and the group would then not fail. It wouldn't have a contract, but they could still earn the money. But they would not earn it with a contract.
Gotcha.
And so we did, as I said, more than 100 experiments. In every group, in every place in the world, every group demanded a contract. And not only that, every group was able to develop a contract. And every group developed it by unanimity. We tried to find out if it made a difference if we changed it to majoritarian. It didn't.
Yes.
Every group did it unanimously. And then there were a few groups, which is kind of interesting, just a very few, where we had some people who were refugees from the Soviet Union. And those people wanted a contract that was fundamentally different than everybody else. They said, we don't want to have any social guarantees. But everybody else in all groups, and they compromised in the end to the same outcome as everybody else had. The outcome was not to maximize the welfare of the worst off, but to set a floor where they said, look, we want to make sure that everybody is at least this well off. We don't want anyone poor. And they were able to earn a lot of money, and then they were taxed. And that was on sort of round one. They would earn their money. They had to develop a whole contract, which would include a tax law.
Yes.
So they earned the money, they paid the taxes, and of course, people who earned a lot of money and paid a lot of taxes, they all wanted a progressive tax system.
I see.
And the people who earned a lot of money paid a lot of taxes. And
before you get into most detail, I wanted to ask you this because we're having trouble in Congress to agree to a minimum wage. What would Rawls say?
Rawls would say we should not only have minimum wage, we should be pushing down the top. Whereas, and let's have a more egalitarian society. But our argument would be that was in fact going against the findings of everything that he conjectured we ought to be looking for. And what we ought to be doing is increasing that, not only the minimum wage, but housing should be available, education should be available. Everything that's required to function as a good citizen in a society like ours should be given to every person.
One last question before we close. Would you recommend a student to read the book?
I would recommend that people read around the book because it's a very complex. His last draft of this book, which is not the original edition you've got, is an easier edition, and it's edited. It comes from some lectures, and it's easier to read.
I think that's what I'll do. Joe, thank you for coming to the Scholars Chair. This has been really enlightening. We have been discussing the book of John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, with Professor Oppenheimer from the University of Maryland. And if you want to see more Scholars Chair, go online to YouTube. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. If you want to send me a question and ask about our guests, you can do so by emailing us to scholarschair@gmail.com. I am your host and producer, Khalil Shadid. Good night.
Amazing.